why should we actually care if there is no ice in the Arctic anymore? Why should we care, for example, in Bremen? And for that we have a very nice set of three people. First is Annika Nilsson, I would like to see here, from the Nordland Research Institute in Bodø in Norway. And she's an interdisciplinary researcher on the politics of Arctic change and works in environmental governance, in communication with the science policy interface. And before entering academia, Annika was a science writer for over 20 years. So she's very experienced in communicating our science to the public, for example. And in FACEIT, she's so far responsible for the participatory scenario workshops and co-leads the policy dialogue efforts. And then, you heard from her already, I would like to call Grete Hovelsrud, also from the Nordland Research Institute, where she is a research professor in social and Arctic anthropology. That's a word I rarely say, I have to admit. And she's also professor in the Nord University in Bodø, and Grete has extensive fieldwork experience with local communities and worked on topics such as fisheries, hunting, agriculture, reindeer herding as well. I read aquaculture in the Arctic and subarctic, and in FACEIT, Grete's focus is to facilitate the co-production of knowledge with the local or also indigenous communities we are working in, and she's leading the synthesis of all our research results, leading then to a policy dialogue led by Annika. And then you may have heard from him already, I would call Geir up front from the Norwegian Polar Institute in Tromsø, and Geir is a senior researcher in toxicology at the Norwegian Polar Institute and professor as well at the University Center in Svalbard. He's working in Kongsfjorden, as it feels like ever since, but actually since 1981. And he's working on seabirds, as you may have heard already, and knows Kongsfjorden maybe better than everybody else. He's also very active in communicating science, for example, in supporting museum exhibitions. For example, the Polaria exhibition in Tromsø was very much supported by him. And Geir is also writing a children's books about all the research he is doing. And I would like to use this cube as well to pose your questions to them. And if you would like, I can start if you want to think about your questions at the moment for the time being. Thank you, okay? Yeah, and the microphone goes to Annika. And maybe to get first, we're in Bremen here, and why, for example, cities like Tromsø or Bodø are kind of caring what climate change is doing to their Arctic or subarctic environment. It's actually pretty clear because they are located where they are located. But how would you consider effects on Arctic climate change to be relevant in Central Europe?
That's quite a tough question. I tell you, we have seen this effect of climate change with regard to the physical, but also the influence on the biological environment in a way. And this is, especially in the what we call European Arctic, where we have this very high temperature compared to all the areas which are affected. And these physical changes, they are really affecting the biodiversity in this area. Not only seabirds and marine mammals, but also fish species are affected. We see new fish species in the area with which are in the Svalbard area. We have no mackerels, we have herring, capelin, cod, and haddock in a way, which are in this area. And the thing is that will these changes which we are seeing now with regard to the affecting the productivity of fish species. The Barents Sea has been a very important area with regard to fishing and so on. We see now the movement of fish species north. Will this have an effect on the productivity and so on of fish? And Norway is nation, producing or selling a lot of fish from this area of Barents Sea. The thing is, will we have the productivity as we have seen in the Barents Sea in the years to come? So I think this is something which may affect, Europe with regard to delivering of fish in the future and so on. So that's one point. The second point is related to this with pollution. We see now that there is heavier, more pollutants to be found. We also see plastic pollution and so on. And this may affecting the health or the quality of the fish and so on. And that is also something which is of importance for Europe, I think.
Thank you, Geir. Questions? Just raise your hands, please. Don't be shy. It's your chance to step into the discussion. Grete, do you have an opinion on that? Why should we care from the anthropological side of things?
Why we should care why the Arctic is melting?
Yeah. Why should we here care in Bremen?
In Bremen or
very
in Europe? Well,
very tough question. I know.
We are losing a very important part of the globe. First of all, with its ecosystems and the lives that are lived there, that are dependent upon these conditions. If you have indigenous communities or local communities, but it's also, if you lift the gaze a little bit, when the Arctic is thawing, there's somewhere else is suffering. So the global south will be highly affected by the changes in the Arctic. So we may say, I live north of the Arctic Circle, and I may say, nice, longer summers, roses in November. Someone else is feeling that in a negative way. So that's another reason why we should care. Our love for the Arctic is strong and deep and so on, but so the loss of it actually gives me great grief to think about it and to see it happening. But it's even worse when the global south is suffering.
Okay. Laura, elbow in the back.
Wow!
My bad. And so I have a question. So we're seeing that many of the species of animals, not including humans, are migrating towards the north, where conditions are getting better. Do we expect also human migration, and how do countries are going to evolve, like the northern countries like Canada and Greenland and Svalbard? Do we think these areas are going to become more like future destinations, and population will increase in these areas, and permanent populations?
I think I can address that from what's happening in the Arctic Sweden. We're having actually a population increase in northern Sweden now after many, many decades of population decline. And that's because there are a lot of mineral resources that people in Europe like to have for green transition and for other things. It's also energy production, energy mills, and in current energy crisis that is actually completely connected with energy prices. So we're having a population increase in northern Sweden and in terms of industry. And that might happen in terms of migration, different people moving in, and how and when and where, that I think is a matter that we don't really know, because it will depend on where the resources are and how those places are connected with infrastructure and other ways with in this case, Europe or other parts of the world.
Yeah, and there's another issue here about the term climate refugees. It's a complicated issue, and the ones that are mostly harmed are poor people in low-lying areas or where desertification is happening. They don't have the resources to move north. So there will be a stronger sort of maybe a class society, those who have the resources to be climate refugees, if you will. We don't like to use that word, but it does say what it says. People with resources, yes, may come north, but the others may not be able to. So we do expect a movement of people who they have to leave their countries, but we also see quite a bit of adaptation, especially to low-lying areas being from sea level rise and so on, are actually adapting in ingenious ways.
I'm born in Finnmark, and in a fishery town, Honningsvåg, that community has decreased, you know, from 5,000–6,000 now, and it's down to 2,000. And we see these changes going on, and I think we will see that, you know, fishery, which has been important in many of these, you know, small villages, will maybe in the future, due to the changes which is happening, be less fishing activity and so on. But this is depending on how the development will be and so on, and which species of fish we're talking about. But this is something which is going on.
Another type of people there might be more of are soldiers. That's actually something that came out of a discussion about potential futures up in Porsangerfjorden. A concern that if the geopolitical situation gets even more tense in northern Norway, that there will be more soldiers, more training, and then competition for land and competition for resources because of that. So the question of more people moving to the Arctic is connected to economy, politics, etc., in a rather complex manner, and it's not to the Arctic as a whole, it might be to specific places. And as we heard earlier, there are a lot more tourist people coming to the Arctic. That's also people affecting the environment, doing things, and people moving from Germany, Holland, other places in Europe to work, in places like Longyearbyen. So it's also becoming, or in Nuuk, it's also becoming more internationalized because of tourism operators coming there. So it's a interesting kind of changing in demography when Arctic opens up.
Yeah, Laura?
So now I have another question, and I'm asking this because we have science and humanities. So it's a little bit of a delicate question. So the policies that we take right now, like what we're doing to change our climate, like the Paris Agreement and all these other things, are they going to make a difference in the near future? Are we going to slow down the climate, the loss of sea ice in the Arctic?
I just want to say a little bit in the start. We have this goal of, they are talking about 1.5 degrees, you know, which is the kind of goal now. And we should, according to the plans which was made, that it was going to be less release of CO2, you know, in the last year. But it didn't happen. We have increased it. I think we will make it for the 1.5. We are talking maybe about 2.5 and maybe 4. This is the development because the politician is not taking the decision needed to be taken with regard to you know, improve this with release of greenhouse gases.
Yeah, there's only one solution: cut emissions. And I don't think the policymakers are listening. I think Neil talked about that. You know, we've seen a lot of. We have the knowledge. We have the knowledge, and we are social scientists, not in the humanities, but we need the humanities as well. People who work with history and other parts of society. But there is only one adaptive measure, and that is to cut emissions, to stop this. We're not doing very well, unfortunately. It's depressing.
And when we cut emissions and want other sources of energy, how do we go about using resources in the Arctic? Do we do it in the same old colonial ways that's always been done? And come with our decisions from Brussels, Stockholm, Oslo, wherever it is, and kind of invade the Arctic with our industrial development with no concern for how people there, what they want? Or do we do it in a different way and listen and have discussions? And I think that is something where decisions, that is a discussion we need to take, because what's green technologies might look green from the point of view of cutting fossil fuels, but they might not be green from a point of view of local sustainability in the Arctic. They may or may not be. It's not that they are always bad, but it needs thinking.
Annika, fitting to that question or to that topic, we are an EU-funded project, and somehow the EU doesn't have any restriction, or very small restriction, over direct areas in the Arctic, because the EU is not in the Arctic, right? It's Norway, not in the EU. Greenland is not part of the EU, like formally, but what are other measures, like indirect things or implications the EU can have kind of effect, or EU policy can have an effect on the Arctic?
I think a very concrete example is to pick up what Geir talked about, plastic pollution. Some of that comes from the fishing fleets up there, and some of those fishing fleets come from European countries. And not to mention the trash that we toss that follow ocean currents up there. So policies in relation to how we handle plastic can have a direct implication. And similarly, that calls for other pollution, other types of pollution too, but it's so very clear with plastic. Market policies. Are we willing to pay a little more for the fish in order to make sure that the people fishing actually get paid for their labor and can buy a boat that doesn't spew out carbon dioxide and soot? How do we act as consumers? Those kinds of things are certainly going to be influencing. And then if EU has also done some things that have not been so popular in the Arctic, like trade bans on seal skins and saying, oh, we should have an Arctic treaty where we should stop all development in the Arctic. So I think that creates a lot of contentions, bad feelings, and political badwill, basically. So the EU can have both positive effects, but it can also put its foot in its mouth and should probably sometimes rather listen than speak.
In all Arctic communities, there is no sewage treatment system. This means that it's a lot which is going to the sea and so on. And in Longyearbyen, which want to be green, you know, all the kind of thing is going out to sea. We have a kind of system which has been established in the Hovelsrud, mechanical and biological treatment of, you know, and it takes a lot away. And that's not expensive and so on. And when they are discussing this in lokalstyret in Longyearbyen, they say that they will just make the pipe further out in the fjord, you know, in a way of, this is not the way to go. If we want to be, you know, we have the question of Svalbard, you know, the best wilderness, they should install this kind of system, and this should, because we know plastic from this sewage is also a part of what we see in the fjords of Svalbard. So there is a lot to be done in order to improve this with plastic. And also, plastic is coming from Russian rivers, you know, from heavily populated area, with the rivers going out to the sea ice, melting into the sea ice. The ice which is melting out in the Fram Strait, it has per liter snow, ice melted, it is 14,000 particles of plastic. So it's, and you can do studies and you can see that this is coming from the Russian area. So it's not coming with the sea ice, and then the question is it affecting, you know, the life of animals which are in the melting zone and so on? That's the question. But we also know that plastic is transported by air and so on. In Pyrenees, if you melt 1 liter of ice there, it is 150,000 plastic particles, which has very small particles. In the ice up in Svalbard, it's 15,000, so it's showing also they are transported to this area. So,
could you toss Sebastian the cube?
Okay. First, Sebastian.
Aha, you did transfer yourself. That's the danger of this. Sebastian.
Thank you. We could read this month that over the last 52 years, population of the planet has doubled from 4 to 8 billion people. How do you see the role of the European Arctic for providing in a sustainable way food, or contributing to providing food?
Yeah, like I said, I think already now, I think Arctic fisheries in general are important enough to be significant in the global food supply. So that is one. One thing that had been discussed here that we don't know whether it's something that will happen or not, but could the Arctic also be a producer of edible seaweed, you know, that type of thing? I don't know if that in terms of the bigger picture, what role that plays. But it certainly is a food supplier already now in a global context, and it's the marine environment that is a food supplier.
And I would say that one thing that's not very popular to say anywhere in Europe is that we do have a large population of some marine mammals that can sustain hunting. It is a food source. I know I'm really sort of swearing in church here, but we have to really understand that we do hunt some whales in the Nordic countries and in other places as well, and it is proven to be sustainable. So I think that Europe is a source of food, but I think that more importantly, maybe we have to think about our consumption patterns for the resources. That if we sort of slow down a little bit on how much food we waste, we have enough for everyone, for an 8 billion population globe. So there are things we can do to think about how to use the environment as it is, but also stop throwing away food.
Inka?
No, she's
Inka,
I would like to come back to the pollution issue. I mean, pollution is known since decades, but pollution is not climate change. And I think it's really very important that politics, I mean, they are in favor of all this plastic business, because, I mean, this is somehow, I don't know, I mean, this is somehow important for the public to see these photos like you showed, Geir, and they are really bad, and I don't want to say something against that. Certainly it's very important to deal with the plastic, but I think it should go one level below. I mean, it's more important to bring the topic of CO2 reduction into the forefront everywhere. And then these other topics might, I mean, because many people cannot differentiate. They see this is a problem, and they don't see that one is conservation in a way and the other is climate change. And so also nature conservation. It's important to have nature conservation, but if we don't reduce CO2, then all this nature is for nothing. And I think this is something we all should bear in mind and also deal like that. Also in our whatever scientific, political discussions.
But there is something which is happening now. We have this IPCC, which is working toward this with climate change, what is happening and so on. And now the United Nations is talking about making a treaty or a panel which is related to plastic pollution and also environmental pollution and so on. And we had a meeting last week and we discussed this with the Norwegian government. They want to try to be a lead in these initiatives and so on. And I think that this is very good, for improving this with the pollution problem and so on.
I think we have to, in a sense, think that they are CO2 emissions, plastics, other types of pollutions are a consequence of our behavior and our consumption, our material consumption, our energy consumption. And that is, in a sense, where we need to start thinking on all of these issues. And of course, that's another swearing. We shouldn't have to change our lifestyle. We shouldn't have to do this and that. But that is actually what we need to do if we're not going to end up in the situation where we reduce CO2 emissions but create other problems instead. We need to think in a different manner. And that is I think is going to be an even more difficult one to discuss and communicate and act on than reducing CO2 emissions, actually.
I just want to say also that plastic industry, the prognosis is 4 times increase of plastic compared to what we have today. They are investing now in factories, the oil companies, to invest in plastic factories and so on. So the prognosis with the problem we have today, this will be a big problem. And the release of CO2 from plastic production is 8% today. It will be 20% in 20 years from now. So it's not going in the right direction.
Pollution.
Yeah.
Janne had a question.
Yes, very interesting with this food and how we eat, because I think today we eat very little from the sea. So we have to also change our mind what kind of food we are eating. And we also know that agriculture is one of the main contributors to CO2. So I think this is something we should look into, new products, how do we make the young people eat more seafood, macroalgae. I know also that they have some components in them, so it's not so good. So more research on that and to develop this product will be important in the future.
Was that Amanda?
Yeah.
I just want to say something about the food. There are two things about food. One is food security, and the other is food safety. And I've also learned about this, the kelp, that it can be poisonous if we don't do it right. So we also need that knowledge about how to use how to create food safety around the new products, to ensure food security.
Amanda?
Yeah. I was thinking about a couple of the topics. We talked about infrastructure in the Arctic and then more people living in the Arctic. And one thing I experienced this summer in the Canadian Arctic, and I'm curious if it's similar in Greenland maybe, is often the very small communities have an open landfill, and there's a lot of pressure because more people are moving, there's no recycling, everything is dumped. And I watched plastic bags. They have a little fence, but in half the days it was on fire, and there's plastic, right, and the people in the community know it's not good, but there's no money. And I was curious if there's similar problems in the European Arctic where the communities themselves are also a source of plastic pollution, and if more people go to the Arctic, is it just going to get worse in that way?
I think Thomas has something directly to that.
Yeah.
Yeah, maybe I can just say that from a Greenland perspective, it is something that is in focus as well. And there is a plan to also develop waste management. I think one of the things, if you look at Greenland as such, is that a lot of what we hear about how Greenland should behave come from the outside rather than from the inside. And we also heard earlier about how if Greenland gets like one major factory or something, it could potentially increase their CO2 emissions a lot. And one of the opinions in Greenland is that of course they have to do what you can in Greenland to reduce emissions and waste, but let us also have our possibility to get our industrial revolution. We haven't had it yet. If we want to move forward economically, we might have to even also have the possibility of opening a mine, opening a factory, something like that. And we also have to look at it relative, because relative to the rest of the world, Greenland is quite, at least to the part we live in, Greenland is quite clean. 70% or 80% of the energy used in Greenland is from hydropower plants. So it's not to excuse what Greenland is doing as such, but it's also to put things into perspective and remember that Greenland is a country where there's people living. It's not a natural reserve. It's a country where people have to live and develop and evolve as well.
I think one also has to think about what capacity the local technologies that exist. Because often the technology is not a technical issue, it's a financial issue. And then it comes back to having the economic base to invest in the waste treatment plant, to invest in a facility that burns in a way that doesn't lead to local emissions, because local emissions in the Arctic is a real problem in many parts, and it varies depending on a little bit how the infrastructure looks like. So I don't think you can say Nordic Arctic is one. It varies across the Nordic Arctic a lot.
Yeah, and I was going to say one good thing about the new industries that are developing in Svalbard, because of the mining is closing and there are other ways to make money, and there's one effort underfoot to find renewable energy that is not come from diesel engines. And there are 1,500 communities all through the Arctic that depend solely on fossil fuels for every ounce of energy they have. And so this is something they're trying to do now in Longyearbyen, actually using that as a laboratory to develop energy sources that can be then transferred to other parts of the Arctic. So many little drops like that. But when it comes to waste management, there is a big difference between the Norwegian North, which is subarctic, and Svalbard or other communities. But in Svalbard there is an environmental station now.
Yeah.
They used to burn everything, I remember, from the 80s. Yeah.
Okay, Geir, then Thomas, then
Yeah.
Rose.
What is interesting in Europe and so on, we see that there is a decrease of putting plastic waste into landfills. And then there is more, which is related to this with using this as a kind of oil, to make heat for hoses and so on. And then the recycling, which is increasing also. But what is the problem is that there is only some of this plastic product which can be used for recycling. We are producing a lot of plastic which are not being, we cannot recycle because we haven't developed the technology. Like PVC, it's 6% of it which can be recycled. So why should we produce plastic which we can't recycle? So there is big challenges here, with technology and development which need to be done.
Thomas?
Yeah, I think when we look at the development also, it is something that quite a few projects are also looking in Greenland how you can get exactly rid of the waste. And one of the things that has come up is that a lot of the plastic that we find in Greenland seem to be local source. So it's not to excuse that you shouldn't do anything locally, but it's just everything has to be put into context, and you also have to change people's minds, because maybe from many Arctic communities you have also looked to the rest of the world and said that this is our problems created by others. And in some aspects it's not the case always, like plastic for instance. But when it comes to other things like CO2 emissions and these things, it is a problem created by the rest of the world. And when you look at a place like Greenland, it's also have to keep in mind all the time that the size of Greenland, it's if you place it in Europe, it goes from Tromsø in Norway to the Bodø of Italy. And the way you manage Greenland, it's actually as an island community. You don't look at it as one country when it's managed by the government. It's managed by city, because you don't have roads in between, you don't have train, you don't have an infrastructure. So it has to be viewed that way as well. And I think that's sometimes forgotten in the aspect of this, that we're talking about a huge country.
Bruce, last one.
Wow, I was gonna go back to Grete's point and thank her about talking about food, but now what Thomas said, what I was gonna say about food is it makes a big difference where your food comes from. And Russia hasn't been talked about up here, but I've been working there since Soviet times and working with reindeer. And one of the ironies I noticed when I went to West Siberia in 1991, the only place you could get reindeer meat was in the cafeteria in the gas fields there. People buying in the market were buying pork and chicken and so on. And the gas you bought in the local shop was from France. So the consumption patterns were completely reversed. And the reason I checked, the reason that people didn't eat reindeer meat was because in Soviet times it was not treated very well. The quality of the meat was very bad. So it's taken a whole, it's still decades later, but still the tastes are so difficult to change. But I think as Annika said, we have to confront those things. And Thomas just drew a line under it. We're also wasting an incredible amount of resources when we're not using things locally, efficiently.
Yeah, thank you. No offense, but from your over 100 years jointly, of academic experience, of professional experience, jointly.
Almost 200 years.
So
that's why we got gray hair. I have at least.
I would like to have one short statement each. What would be your wish for a good development in the Arctic? What would be a good perspective where Face It, for example, could be a little drop into the lake of good developments. Yeah.
There are we have been hearing about new rules coming with regard to environmental protection in Svalbard and so on. And I hope that there will be improved rules, with regard to where the traffic go and, but you shouldn't get close to polar bears and, all these kind of things, which is now being initiated. But there is a lot of lobbying going on, and we will just have to see what happens. But for me, I hope that that future generation will be able to see the beauty of this Arctic, and that's my goal. My grandchildren, I hope they will see Svalbard in the way I have seen it, and that's just a hope.
My hope is that for securing the Arctic is increasing our knowledge and have more students coming to study and to learn.
Careful what you say. It's a lot of students.
I know. Come to Bodø. I can have a little recruitment desk here tomorrow for you. We have projects you can work on. But I really do think we have to. It's this idea that the Arctic is I thought Lil said so well here. It's like this saga, Arctic saga somewhere else. But it isn't. Arctic is not isolated from the rest of the world, I've been saying a few times. So to understand the Arctic as it is, as we want it to be, we don't want it to change too much. We want the ice. And also see it in relation to the rest of the globe. That's one hope that I have, and I hope that we can do that when we are looking, and face it, at the fjord systems and the sustainability of these fjord systems, that this knowledge can be generated to also speak outside of the Arctic, but it's certainly for the whole Arctic.
I don't know how this is related to face it, but I think a really important part would be peace in Ukraine. And I say that because that has been devastating to circumpolar Arctic cooperation. And the knowledge we have about the Arctic today as a circumpolar region and the policy impact research has had, many positive impacts, in, for example, reducing some pollution, that was possible because of cooperation on a circumpolar level. With Russia, half the Arctic not being part of that cooperation, we lose something critically important in terms of understanding the circumpolar development, but also directly affecting addressing pollution issues, addressing emissions of greenhouse gases, addressing emissions of soot, etc., that have a direct impact also on climate change in the Arctic. So I would say peace in Ukraine would be the most immediate, critical thing to happen.
I can't let Grete have this invitation to Bodø. I will also say that it's so important. If you want to learn about the Arctic, UNIS at Svalbard is the great place.
Yeah, I think that was a nice statement round at the very end of this. Thank you very much, the three of you, for standing here as a panel. Thanks to all the questions and for you listening here. For me, I can say it's nice working with you and trying at least to coordinate this very nice project. You are all very nice people, and I hope we can be some drops in the lake of hope for the Arctic. I would like to invite all of you to have a beer outside with us, to have a cold drink. I think there's also still coffee there, if somebody fancies a coffee. Stick around and have a chat and follow up on the invitations you just got.